Okay, we're going to start up again. Now we're going to talk about horizontal, vertical, and cluster approaches to growth. And Jeff Mason from CCI is going to be our moderator. Jeff, over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone. So when we talk about growth, and we've heard this already, this means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It directs us to different levels of action. So right at one hand, you have the decisions being made by individual firms in response to the incentives that they're facing, and you'll hear about that after lunch. Of course, at the other end of the spectrum, right, you have the big sort of macro decisions being made, basic rule of law, these kind of really big picture things. But there's this wide berth in the middle where we can really start to talk about concrete examples of action, things that are being done that we can learn from, that we can replicate to drive growth. And so that's what this panel is going to try to dig into a little bit and start to getting into the okay, what do we do? What have other people done with regards to growth? So each panelist is going to give an introduction for several minutes to a specific project, investment, policy, something that they've worked on that's been an important driver of growth in one form or another. And then we'll go into a discussion and how what they're doing relates to this central theme of growth. So joining me for this discussion, we have Piero Ghezzi. He's the former Minister of Production of Peru and is also the founding partner and CEO of GPD Partners, which provides private credit to mid-sized agribusiness firms. We have Ahmed Khalid Ben Ammar. He's a senior advisor to the Minister of Economy and Finance of Morocco and has worked on the Tangier Med port and industrial project in Tangier. We have Solly Angel. He's a professor of city planning and director of the Urban Expansion Program at the Marin Institute of Urban Management at New York University. And finally, we have Aradhana Agrawal. She's senior advisor to the Trade, Technology, and Skills team at the National Council of Applied Economic Research in India. So thank you all for joining me for this discussion. And Piero, we'll start with you. So during your tenure as Minister of Production in Peru, you pioneered a new approach to private sector, public sector collaboration. And this is something we've heard a lot about, I think, in sort of general terms, right? Public and private should work together to facilitate growth. It's not purely an exercise of one or the other. They need to work together, but it's important to understand what does working together mean in sort of real terms, and how can we do that productively? Because I'm sure plenty of people in this room, you've been to some sort of public-private meeting, dialogue, whatever, and you probably left that thinking, what in the world did this accomplish? This was a waste of time. And so, right, but we need to have those conversations, so we should have them productively. And that's something that I think you tried to work on as Minister, Piero. So please tell us about that.
Thanks, Jeffrey, and thanks very much for the invitation. Yeah, I'm going to talk about mesas ejecutivas. It's an instrument for industrial policy or productive development policies, as we call them euphemistically in Latin America, that we designed and implemented while I was Minister of Production of Peru between 2014 and 2016. Basically, it was a very practical approach. My background is international finance. Until 2013, I was chief economist of Barclays globally. So I had not a background in economic development, so I was not so invested. So when I became Minister of Production, we had launched a productive diversification plan, and now we had to implement and choose the sectors, et cetera. So our reaction was to hire McKinsey. No, I mean, an international consultancy firm, right? That was the first reaction. Upon reflection, we decided to convene the main players ourselves, particularly the private sector guys who had shown some interest in working in this public-private collaboration, and start solving problems as opposed to studying the problems, just studying the problems. So we start to work from the very beginning. And basically, in Peru, there are like 200 working groups and round tables and multilateral commissions, et cetera, that didn't work. So basically, we analyze them and multiply everything by -1. No? And we did the opposite. So 3 or 4 characteristics had these working groups that didn't work in our review. The first is that the private sector was only an occasional guest in these commissions, as opposed to a permanent active member that participated in the co-creation of solutions. So we invited them permanently. No? The second is that the public sector invited in these commissions many times are the guys officially designated by the entity, maybe the COO of the entity, but not the guy who knows about the issues, about the problems, and who has to sign at the end. So at the mesas, we invited them, the right guys, the guys that should know or should know about the problems, no? And have the responsibility of sign whatever is needed. Also, we had a dedicated team. This is very important. So somebody whose main job is to work with these mesas, not something that they do on top of 10 more things. They may do other things, but the most important thing they do is mesas ejecutivas. So we had this dedicated team. And the fourth thing is that in these traditional working groups that Peru had, there were votes and minutes. It was too rigid. And also because we want to do the right thing, not what the majority wants. So we eliminated the rigidity. And three more things about what a mesa ejecutiva is. First, we had like two bodies. The low-level body, the guys with the contextual knowledge, the guys who know the problems, right? And are in charge of solving those problems. That includes the private sector, the public sector guys, and the dedicated team. But some problems cannot be solved at a more technical low level. So have to be elevated to the cabinet level ministers, right? They have the ability to allocate budget, right? Convene the right guys, solve problems that require some political decision, etc. And so we have this combination of bottoms up and top down. Neither of those, right? It was a combination of things. The other stuff that we did is that we start working, as I said, we didn't spend time in writing like long reports or having a very detailed roadmap that had to be executed later. We started working with 3 or 4 solutions from the very beginning, and that helped a lot. And also, in addition to the mesas, right? So the mesa's name is wrong. In what sense? You think of a mesa as an institution, right? A table. But the mesa is a technology. It's a methodology to work, right? To have a process of solving problems, right? So we had, in addition to the plenary sessions, if you wish, of a mesa, we had a lot of bilateral meetings, right? One-on-one or smaller meetings where the problems and solutions identified in the plenary session of the mesa are worked out, okay? So we had these, the plenary sessions, and this is intersessional meetings, but a lot is being done. I would say the majority of the work is in these smaller meetings, no? So because of the way it was worked, the private sector guys who were used to this waste of time, all these mesas that were like round tables, they were invited and they didn't get anything done. So you go to ventilate your problems, your frustrations, and then you go and nothing happened. Okay, they called them ejecutivas. So initially, we didn't have the name the last name ejecutivas because we executed. So they called them ejecutivas. The model has continued in Peru until now. I left in 2016, so it's been 8 years that with, 7 presidents, 14 finance ministers, and the mesas have continued, which is a testament of that, of the institutionalization of the issues, right? Okay, so when I was finishing the ministry, only then that Chuck Sawyer came to Peru, and we realized that the stuff that we had done resembled significantly the stuff that he had been writing about, government experimentalism, etc., and some of the modern industrial policy that Danny had been writing about. But I was not fully aware of that literature. I was not fully is too much. I was not aware of that literature really because my background was more of international finance. So we did what it worked in practice. At the end, the mesa's main issue is try to solve the main coordination problems that government has. The private-public coordination problems, because the public sector underestimates the complexity of the problems. And the private sector may know the problems, but they don't know about public policy. They don't know the solutions, right? And also the easiest way is to ask a subsidy, right? Because it's a lot harder to co-create and to working on solutions, etc. So it's a lot of it. Give me an exception, tax exception, subsidy, and that's a lot easier, right? So this sort of public-private, and they don't trust each other. That's your stuff. And I have been visiting throughout Latin America, And it's a characteristic of all governments. The public sector thinks the private sector are just lobbyists, and the private sector thinks the public sector, and the private sector thinks the public sector are just like lazy guys who don't get anything done, right? So that was one thing that we tried to solve. And the other stuff that is perhaps more important is the public-public coordination failures. Why? Because that government entities work as watertight compartments. They don't acknowledge the existence pretty much of other entities. They work as if they were the only entity existing, right? Even within my ministry, the two vice ministries had nothing to talk to, they didn't talk to each other, let alone the entities that depend on the ministry, right? The independent entities. So, and this is worse because a lot of the coordination failures are local, but the solutions may require national decisions. So you have this not only between government entities at national level, but between entities at different levels of government, right? And this has become even more pronounced over the last years because better standards globally, environmental, social, labor, cultural, whatever standards, have resulted in new entities, a Ministry of Culture, a Ministry of Environment, a Ministry of Social Issues, etc. So that the number of watertight compartments have become even bigger, right? So that need for coordination. So the mesas were totally directed at trying to solve those issues. In terms of that, what would be the main takeaways for me about the mesas? I want to do more things, the takeaways, and then something that I hear let me talk about something I heard yesterday that I think is, it should be qualified, right? I think precisely because Peru has weak government capabilities, you should do this sort of industrial policy. Why? Because the problems exist and need to be solved, and that more typical industrial policy of picking winners and subsidizing them is just too expensive and doesn't guarantee any success. But the mesas allow you to do a few things, I guess. The first, you leveraged. So the public sector leveraged on the knowledge of the private sector, right? And also, to be sitting in the same place allows you to do two things. Align the private sector and the public sector in a mission. So public sector, there's a mission. We need to make sure to export shrimps to China. So we need to open the market for that, and we need to do everything required to do that. This is like a Matsukato type of mission, right, that I think is interesting. Also, it becomes evident what public sector employees are lazy, don't want to work, have a wrong mentality, don't have an idea of what, everything becomes evident. So it really breaks the inertia that is natural to the public sector, and it really allows them to work together. The second thing is that over time, there's a lot of learning by doing. So you not only solve problems, but you learn to solve problems. So I think that was probably the main contribution of the MESA, is just that we design a new instrument, but also we solve problems, and in the process, the learning process was super strong, right? It's super important. Also, as the views, what was interesting is, for example, we had a MESA for mining. So initially, the mining ministry and the environmental ministry had very different views. Over time, they're working together really. They coalesced, right? The view became one, and that has allowed continuity, because if you have 10 finance ministers or 10 energy ministers, to have a MESA allows the continuity that survives the different administrations, and I think that's super important. This idea of it's not written in law. Actually, the MESA's program was only created 5 years after they started. So it's like, I think like Lamprecht is there, right? I mean, what is building capabilities is you don't create institutions to do, but you do first, and then institutions are created over time. And I think that's super. I mean, when I read the book after I finished the Ministry of Production, really, a lot of stuff really resonated, because that was exactly what I experienced, right? To finalize, so it also allows to use very scarce resources. What are the two most scarce resources in my view? One, capable government bureaucrats. Second, bandwidth of the high-level cabinet, right? The time of the cabinet level guys. So you optimize, and you are going to solve these problems. You prioritize in a way, implicitly or explicitly, if you wish, and it's also a very cost-effective way of doing industrial policy, because you don't need to spend a lot of time, right? Because a lot of times there's wrong regulations, right? Lack of coordination between different government entities, right? That they don't enter together, contradictory requirements, etc. That really is the cause. Was really the orange juice and the sandwiches, right? In the meetings. Really, you don't need a lot of. Over time, the mesas have become more expensive the way, because we have created infrastructure, but in a very informed way of prioritizing the public budget, right? So that was super interesting. But the 10 takeaways for me: first, have the right guys on the room, right? The right guys on the bus. See the right private sector guy, the right public sector guys. The first thing. Thanks. Start doing, instead of spending a lot of time creating all this paraphernalia and all this infrastructure for the quality system or for competitiveness, all these consejos nacionales de competitividad productiva. Just start doing stuff, and your stuff will come, right? The third, really go against the human nature of thinking linearly. Think recursively, right? Because it's impossible to have a diagnosis so detailed that just has to be implemented. You will learn a lot during execution, and then you will go back and forth between diagnosis and execution, right? You have an initial plan, but it has to be preliminary. Work on a productivist approach. I think it's very important. We, at least at the very beginning, we said subsidies and exceptions are not discussed in this table, because otherwise people will go there immediately, right? The natural thing to do for a private sector. Fifth, keep an open architecture. So no, we didn't have a very rigid cast of the same guys. The problems keep changing, so convene the right guys who know the problems, not the guys who are just the general managers of the main lobby, right, the association, right? Make sure also the learning cycles are short. So as a minister, it's very easy to fool yourself that you did your job because you passed a law or you allocated the budget, right? But that may have no implication, no impact at all at the context level. So try to make sure that you have the problems, right? That you identify the problems and get mechanisms to really learn and shortening the learning cycle. Sixth or seventh, I guess, seventh. Just make sure you can elevate problems, because this idea of combining the contextual knowledge of the guys who are on the ground and know the problems with the power of the ministers, of the cabinet ministers, levels have been the president, is super strong, right? You need to be able to elevate problems. Otherwise, things, right, stay very, very small. If you nano development, if you wish, right? If you are not be able to elevate problems, the problem that you can solve becomes smaller. Eighth, have really a dedicated team. This is very important. The very best public servants should be in this small group. And the group that we had didn't have more than 8 or 10 people. It's a small group, but very good guys, and very transversal. So the different mesas were seen by the same people, because there's a lot of knowledge that goes, that is very transversal. And make sure that these guys are housed in the right place. It's very tempting sometimes to house the guys in the private sector, I think, but normally the private sector, they will not have the knowledge or the power to really to make sure that you move the public sector. So normally it's better to be in the public sector. And when I left the government, they moved from the Ministry of Economy and Production, which is where I was, to the Ministry of Finance. It was a lot better to be there, because then the Ministry of Finance can really help allocate budget and really, right, give direction, right? I mean, Minister of Transportation, you need this, okay, I'm gonna give you money, right? But on exchange, I'm gonna be doing that, right? If you don't do that, it's okay, but you need to be cognizant of the limits of having time is up, and I will finish in 1 minute. And the last one, I think, is what I said before. Just make sure to remember the mesas are more like a methodology or a technology to solve problems. And that allows really to use it in very different contexts, right? It can be like mesas to a very specific issue versus a very large issue, for a more political issue, more social issue, a more technical sector. So really, the methodology can be adopted to very different contexts. So if you think of them as a methodology, as I said, a message is a bad name because everybody thinks that it's just sitting in the table, right? You get a lot more done. That's it. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Piero. Now let's jump over to Ahmed. So you've been intimately involved in Morocco's Tanger Med project, right? This is a hugely successful port and industrial complex, and it covers a wide range of sectors, so automotive, aeronautics, food processing, textiles, and many others. It's the largest port in Africa and in the Mediterranean. And in last year's World Bank's port competitiveness report, it was number 4 in the world in terms of port competitiveness. So there's something really impressive, I think, that has been built here, and in a relatively short period of time. I think it commenced in 2007. 8 to 10 years later, right, there was another phase developed. So this has happened relatively quickly. So, with your involvement, Ahmed, in the project, what are 2 or 3 of sort of the practical factors that most led to Tanger Med's spectacular success?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being there. I will try to share some of the highlights of this experience. So there is something we are talking about growth and development, and for me, there is something that is fundamental. It's the common sense. So sometimes we forget it. And when I will talk about Tanger Med and some achievements of Morocco, of the Kingdom of Morocco, they are sometimes related to that, to the being on the very ground and at the level of common sense. So I will talk about tools related to territory, one tool, explain a little bit, and also at the central level, and maybe relate that to risk management also, because it's important on this context. So related to the territory approach, the north region of Morocco has a very great history, cultural also, cultural heritage, but it was a poor region for decades. And we had some instabilities on that region also for decades, because it's the gateway between a lot of things, between Arabo-Islamic worlds and Europe, Occident, also between Africa and Europe, between Morocco and Spain, and so it's boundary zone, and it's complicated. We have only 14 kilometers of sea, but it's kind of towards. So we had all the bad aspects that are related to this kind of places for decades. For example, the trafficking, a lot of issues that were there, and also la contrebande, a lot of issues that were very famous for that region. So it was the situation that was there for a long time. So what was the first thing we did? And it's something that is related to the common sense. So it's the strategic vision. So the king say, the issue is that you have that region, like that, unemployment rate, problems, but at the same time you have 100,000 ships that cross the Strait of Gibraltar. So maybe the first idea is that we have that flow, so maybe we will take a little bit from that flow. At that time we didn't have any port on the big port on the Mediterranean, so we had only Algeciras in Spain that has the monopoly of the activity, the shipment activity. So the vision of His Majesty the King was to build that port. So it was the beginning. So the strategic vision to build that port, and to have also an industrial vision to make that region an industrial hub, and also to have urban planning that is connected to that region, and to achieve that in a reasonable while of time. So in 2004, when the project was launched, there was nothing. Today, as you said, as you mentioned, Tanger Med is the biggest port not only on Africa but also on the Mediterranean region, which means that it's bigger than all the European ports that are in the Mediterranean region. The region is the first car producer in Africa. The first exported sold car in Europe is coming from that region. We had also improved a lot of indicators of development and of competitivity. And also we had the infrastructure that go with that. So we have the highway system and also the first speed train of Africa that goes at 3,020 kilometers. So the first thing was that strategic vision. It was necessary and it was implemented. And sometimes it's the game changer. It's come from the common sense. When you have very high, as we heard yesterday, political will, and the political choice was done. But when the project has been implemented, in the first year we had some very big issues. Because the big projects, sometimes they attract talent from other places, not from the local population. And we still had the issues I told you before. So the second point in the regional level, that come also from the common sense, is that you understand what people need. So we worked from 2010, 2011, on a very, very wide program that tried to understand, spend 2 years understanding what people need. And what we found is that state and ministries, they are just having their sectorial strategies, and they are were trying to reach the average of development in rural areas. But in reality, when we go to the deep dive, we have found, for example, some very interesting thing. We found, for example, that local authorities and population at household level, they say that all what was done in education, economic opportunities, and health was not the priority for them. So the priority for them was the road system. And it was not at that moment the very first priority of the government. So we tried to match that. So when we worked on the very basic needs, and they were saying road system, it was not obvious, but in reality it was because it was sometimes related to feeling, for example, the insecurity for women to go to economic activity or to children to school, to difficulties for selling goods, artifacts, handicrafts, all that kind of stuff. So when the priority has switched to the road at very local level, and when the state and the government understand that he has to match a little bit with the population need, it was not easy. Because the ministers, they said, no, we have a plan, we have averages, we have some standards to reach. But we tried to do that, and we began with no money at this time. And now, 15 years later, it has changed completely the face of North region and rural areas. So they reached almost the standards, the national standard level, and it was a program that began with nothing, and now maybe it's $2 or $3 billion that was spent on these very, very remote areas, using also a new indicator of social landlock that was for the first time not measuring access only to public services, but trying to have a balanced indicator of also the distance to the main services. So it was something that was completely new in Morocco. So the second tool here is how you make this inclusion of the people, how you make the participatory approach, but that is very ground, that is at the very ground level, and that has impact. So it's the first thing. At the central level, it's my second point. I had the chance to be the head of the government delivery unit for 4 years, so with the prime minister. These tools are very important. How to deliver, something that is related to, well, you have a political will, but sometimes, and we see that in Morocco and also other countries, some other countries, you have a political party or coalition that comes, they say they have program, but at the midterm they change the priorities and they begin to talk on something else. So for the first time, we decided that we have to be completely transparent and focused on the commitment of the government. So we implemented that delivery unit at the head of government level, which was in charge of 2 things. The first thing is to accelerate and to make the arbitration with the head of government. So it means a routine, daily with him, bi-weekly with all the committee and all the ministers involved, and to have also that ability to showcase the results to the other ministries and to involve also. The second point on that delivery unit is that you manage time, because you don't have to do the job of the other ministries, but you have to follow the key timelines of the reforms and the key timelines of the programs. So it was something that was very interesting and successful. One of the biggest achievements, there are 2 achievements. One is related to the basic TINC indicators. So for example, for the COVID period, Morocco was a very good example on, I guess, in some aspects of the management of COVID. So in 2021, after the very difficult year, we had the strongest economic growth in Africa. It was 8%. And also a lot of indicators that were, we had a very strong recovery in a lot of sectors after the COVID. So it's one of the effects of this kind of tools. But the second one also is that you are more transparent and more inclusive, and also more visibility of public policies. So it's very important to focus on delivery when you are seeking growth or development. So my third point is more related to risk management. There's also something that was specific in Morocco in this year and also in last time is related to disasters and to this kind of issues. Because as you know, it takes sometimes hundreds of years to build a city, but you can destroy it very easily. So we had, for example, the big earthquake in Morocco. We had also the flood in Libya, the tragic events also in Gaza, Palestine. A lot of situations when a city that has long time to be built, it can collapse. So what we did, we had the earthquake in Morocco in September last year, 2023. It was very difficult to have that earthquake. So there is something here. You can just see the earthquake happens or flood or disaster or war, and you say, okay, I stop with that. I have the hands, les mains liées, as we say in France. But in reality, even these events have a tragic cost, it's an opportunity for the countries after that to rebuild better. So I think it's something also that we do in Morocco. We use it, for example, the earthquake of 2023 to make a program of reconstruction that were implementing all the tools I say, delivery, inclusion, understanding people's needs, and not only giving aid to people to just survive, but also to try to understand the economic opportunities that you have in some disasters. And it's also something that is interesting in Morocco in urban planning. It's also an opportunity to improve the urban planning in these disaster regions. So sometimes when we talk about disaster or risk management, we just talk about how to be resilient and how you forecast. Sometimes just God will, you cannot do anything. But there is also this reflection to have before on how you can use that constraint as opportunities. So I will stop here. I hope I was not too long, but thank you very much.
No, thank you. And actually, before we move on to Salih, I noticed there's an interesting point of similarity between both of you, and this was the focus on some sort of delivery or this action unit that really I think stood out to me as something that can be a catalyst for sort of moving beyond the bureaucracy and sort of grudging nature of how that goes and getting things done. So maybe we can circle back on that. I'm going to go to Salih next. So we can't talk about growth and investment and all these kind of things without actually talking about the physical places, the cities, the regions, where that's actually taking place. And Ahmed started to get into some of this as well. Because with the built environment, with the spatial dimension of a city, a region, a country, what that looks like and how that's deployed has implications for economic activity, economic organization. There's a classic example that I think comes to mind. The commissioner's plan for New York of 1811. So lower Manhattan has been settled, but nowhere near the full island. And they lay out a grid, very simple grid with small plots demarcated all the way up Manhattan Island. And so well in advance of human settlement, you get these very functional land markets that really could not have existed had you not done that planning for that expansion. And that has obvious economic spillovers if we continue on. And so this really, I think, gets at what the core of Salih's work is urban expansion. And so at the Marin Institute, where Salih leads the urban expansion program, they've worked on a very simple but I think elegant solution to the problems of urban expansion. I think my colleague Mark mentioned in his opening remarks yesterday, Africa alone is expected to add 1 billion new urban residents by 2050. That's a lot of expansion planning to do. I think Salih can give us some insight here into some work that he and his Marin colleagues have done in Ethiopia and elsewhere on the issue of urban expansion.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Yes, when you read a lot of reports that start with talking about urbanization, so usually give you some statistic that says so many people will come to cities in the next 20 or 30 years. And then we move on to talk about something else. But nobody actually knows what it means for all these people. Like you were saying, a billion new people are going to come to cities. Okay, so a billion new people are going to come to cities. I mean, a billion came before, another billion will come now. So it's not, what about that? And the interesting thing is to translate that into something that we can do. And the way to do that is to say, okay, so when these people come, they're going to have to be settled, and they're going to use land. So we're going to have to convert a lot of land to urban use to accommodate all these people. Okay. So if we're talking now about converting land to urban use, this is something that we can really already discuss. This is something completely concrete. There's so much land needs to be converted properly to urban use. So we just mentioned that, you know, if a billion people come to Africa, they need to be accommodated in some way. And the way they are accommodated typically is by the densification of the existing building footprints and by the expansion into new areas. The green agenda suggests that most of them should be accommodated within already the existing footprints, because we don't really want more sprawl, more expansion. This is more costly for infrastructure. It takes away agricultural resources and so on. However, we need to remember that not all the population can be accommodated through densification. So a study that we did showed that over the last 25 years, 75% of the population of cities was accommodated in expansion, and 25% was accommodated through densification. So even if it's 40-60, we still have 60% of the people that are going to be accommodated through expansion. And what are we going to do about that? So I think that Ahmed was mentioning urban planning. You mentioned it a couple of times. The urban planning was is a profession that was created to deal with that, to prepare territory for occupation. And unfortunately, it has, in the conditions prevailing in places like Sub-Saharan Africa, take an example, or North Africa, or Asia, Latin America, the way that cities develop and expand is not in a planned way. So urban planning has largely failed us. It wasn't necessarily the blame of urban planning, because the instructions that they got were irrelevant and undoable. Think of it. The planned land use. Now, it doesn't really matter what the land use is on any one piece of land. It's mostly, we can talk about mixed use. We don't have to segregate land uses anymore. So land use is not really a kind of a logic for planning. It says, okay, so plan land subdivisions. So you subdivide the land. So all the land subdivision laws come from the north, and they say that a land subdivision should be fully supplied with all the services, that roads should be built, the lamp posts should be up, the drainage should be there, the sewage, the electricity, before it is occupied, right? That is still the law. And it never happens in any of these places. Places get settled, and land subdivisions get serviced over a period of 30 or 40 years. Look at the building codes. The building codes say a building should be fully constructed, built, and inspected, and a certificate of occupancy should be issued to the building before it is occupied. Think about what is happening in all the places that we know. Houses are built over time. They're built gradually, they may be a certificate of occupancy may be something that you can look at after 30 years. So none of the rules that these poor urban planners have to work with are actually workable. Not only that, they create plans while, and this is like where the MESA thing comes in, while all the other ministries have got investment plans and ideas, they've got nothing to do with urban planning. And there's no, it's not like the urban planners are sitting at the MESA and list and saying, okay, so I have to do this, I have to do that. They're not even there. They're creating plans that are decorating the offices of municipalities, and they are always colorful because every land use is in a different color, which is wonderful. But other than that, it's very bothersome. So you have to think about a method of dealing with urban expansion, which is serious. When you talk about urban expansion, let me just give you a number to give you an idea of how much urban expansion there is. The city of Paris in 1810 was 11 square kilometers and had 500,000 people. The city of Paris now is 11 million people and occupying 2,200 square kilometers. So what happened is the population of Paris grew about 22-fold, and the area of Paris grew 220-fold. So the cities grow and expand, they also lose density. When you're better off, you consume more land. Again, if you compare Paris to, let's say, Lagos, Paris is 3.5 times, about the same population, and Paris occupies 3.5 times the area of Lagos, when it's because its income is so much higher, 10 times higher or more than the income in Lagos. So as cities grow and expand, population and income explain 85% of that expansion. You know, when a city doubles in population, it increases by 70%. When a city doubles in income, it increases by 55%. So you have this enormous expansion. And you have a place like Accra that quadrupled its population in the last 20, 25 years and grew 8-fold at the time. So you come to mayors and you say to them, the urban expansion planning here is, you're thinking 20, 30% over the next 10 years. No, we're talking about Lilongwe, I was talking with Thomas before, tripling its area in the next 20, 30 years. What are you going to do about it? Nothing. Okay, so what we're saying, the only thing you need to do about it, the only thing you need to do about it is to estimate how much land you're going to need in the next 30 years, to locate this, to find places for this land, and to identify no-build zones. You know, like I really don't want development here. I really don't want development there. In the rest of the land, you create an arterial road grid, 25 to 30 meter roads spaced 1 kilometer apart throughout this expansion area. And you get the right of way for that grid now. Because, as we were talking before, once the place is settled, getting an arterial road through is going to cost 100 times more, and it's going to be impossible politically. So here is an investment that you can put that's going to cost you less than 1% of what it would cost you if you wanted to do it later. But you have to do it now. So, and why would we need an arterial road grid? That gets me back to the kind of the topic of the conference, because what we need for these cities to be productive is for their economies to be integrated, for them to be connected. The reason that larger cities are more productive than smaller ones is because their economies are larger and they function as one economy. And you stopped my flow of thinking, sorry. And where the productivity gets created by all workers having access to all jobs and all firms having access to all workers. So that's why you don't want to create like these large informal areas on the peripheries of cities that are like autarkic economies. I cut your hair, you buy my food, I take care of your children, I fix your house. But there's no economic growth out of that. So unfortunately, I have a limit on my time. So we have actually done that in a couple of places. We started in Colombia. We're very successful in Ethiopia. And we just completed an evaluation of the urban expansion program in Ethiopia for with funding by Open Philanthropy that showed that where we had these arterial road grids, that they had significant impacts on socioeconomic outcomes, on health outcomes. More businesses were opened. They were better connected to services and jobs. And the interesting thing is we just kind of provided the capacity for local municipalities to create these urban expansion programs, but they did it themselves. They did it themselves, and they got the funding themselves. Actually, a lot of it was kind of self-generated funding because they opened new lands for settlement, which then kept housing affordable and kept income coming back to the municipality in terms of either selling of plots or property taxes and so on. So these programs have worked. So at Mekelle, which is a city in the Tigray region which was involved in civil war, that was where the most successful place was. So these arterial road grid created areas for industrial parks, for affordable housing development, and many of those served to accommodate the internally displaced persons during the war. So it even provided this kind of cushion. You were talking about, Ahmed, about kind of risk. You create areas that then can function in a multiplicity of ways depending on how you need them. So this has worked, and the difference between this and other, and kind of the way that the market develops these expansion areas is precisely in attention to the public goods, to the roads and the arterial roads and the open spaces and the streets that get left open when development happens. Now, markets don't do that. Markets don't create arterial roads. Government creates arterial roads. And once you create that system, then development can come, then developers can come, then you can do subdivision, then you can do all of that. With the time allotted to me, I have to stop.
Thank you, Sally. So let's jump to Aradna, and I think you'll be able to tie all of these threads together really nicely for us with the case study that I know you'd like to discuss. So in your career, in your research, you've studied special economic zones, all throughout Asia and elsewhere. And more recently, you've done a sort of deep case study on one particular SEZ. This is Sri City. It's just north of Chennai. And there's a lot of interesting parallels that I think you were able to draw to the case of Shenzhen, which is kind of everybody's gold standard ideal of what an SEZ could be or do. So tell us a little bit about the experience of this particular zone.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey, and thank you, CGD, for having me on board. And I see Shekhar here, my former boss. Very happy to see him here. Well, actually, I'm going to tell you a story of Sri City. And this story, I think, needs to be told because it tells us about how an incentive program introduced by the government to attract, to mobilize private investment in city building and in growth can be so effective as a tool of growth. Well, in 2005, the government of India introduced the SEZ Act 2005. This act triggered protests across the country. Violent protests happened throughout the country, and the governments lost interest, and they started backtracking. Incentives were withdrawn gradually. And government was not really keen to know what the problems the private investors were facing, because they actually had already invested in the beginning. In this kind of scenario, there were some case studies that stood out and that showed how sort of an approach which is so full of empathy and passion and determination can lead to a successful project of urbanization. And this is the story that I'm going to tell you today. The city was set up by a private developer. And the city was set up in one of the most backward regions of south of India. There was nothing. It just arose in the middle of nowhere. The investor was a private entrepreneur, and he had a very successful business in the United States. But in response to this SEZ Act, he went back to India to give to his own people. Well, this economy was so poor at that time. It was predominated by subsistence rice cultivation and fishing. Land holdings were very small at that time, and most of 73% of land holdings were 1 acre or even below that. Only 3% land holdings were above 4 acres, but 75% of land in those holdings was barren. There was no urban agglomeration within the radius of 25 kilometers in this area. The land was acquired by the private developer, and it was around 7,500 acres of land which was acquired, and it covered 15 villages. These villages were actually governed by this barter system of trade, because the economy was predominated by subsistence farming, and no agriculture, no irrigation. Agriculture failure was quite frequent at that point in time. Then there was abject poverty. People were living in mud houses. Educational attainment was very, very low. Women were married off at an early age, and they also got widowed at an early age. This is what I was told. There was no access to basic amenities like water. There were only wells, so and no toilets. Open defecation was prevalent throughout the region. So this was a kind of situation in which this land was acquired. And within a decade and a half, we find that the situation has totally changed. It has become sort of very, this has become a sort of industrial city, and it has come out as a fast-growing city in this area. Well, what is the scenario today? Let's have a look here. There are 220 companies, and these companies are from 30 countries in this city. 62,000 people are directly employed. Now you can see, I mean, if you add 1.5 times of this, then you can get the total employment. 52% are women. So it's a story of women empowerment in a way. And large industrial cluster has come up in the region. And this cluster is not of textile industry. It is a cluster of light engineering industries. And within that large cluster of light engineering, there are 3 distinct sectoral clusters. One is of the cluster of air conditioning firm. This is one of the largest cluster of air conditioning firms in India. In addition, there is a cluster of automobile firms who are especially from Japan. And then we have a cluster of the logistics service providers. In addition, there are companies from pharmaceutical industry, from food industry, and the companies that are producing metro rail equipments. So this is the kind of scenario currently. But it is not only about being in industrial cluster, you see. There is a very sophisticated social infrastructure, and actually this came before the city. It was inhabited by people, and we have this, residential houses, and we have shopping arcades there, playgrounds. Then there are educational institutions that are attracted. One university is there, then one management school, engineering school, international school. And then we have a number of private schools that have really cropped up in this area. The city is now expanding. Initially, it was 7,500 acres. Now, 3,500 acres are being additionally developed by the developer. But that's not all, because new projects are now coming up. Two mega automobile projects have already come, and they are in the same region, and it's going to really benefit the whole evolution of the city. And this actually is going to also benefit the labor markets, because there is a sort of competition now, and that's what I observed there. In fact, I spent 5 weeks there in 2021, and I spoke with a number of stakeholders, and they involved the developer, companies, employees, service provider, as well as the households. And I, in fact, collected some hard data from households, and I processed that data, and using all those quasi-experimental techniques, and what I found was that a massive economic transformation is underway in this part of the world. It is in terms of incomes, household assets, and the living standards, as well as educational attainment. There is this growth actually is accompanied by structural transformation. And this structural transformation, yesterday Kunal was talking about, is not only from agriculture to manufacturing or services. This structural transformation is also about the patterns of employment. You see, we have now shift from informal to formal employment, and we have all the benefits, that are going to these people. But what is more important to me was the shift in the structure of the society. It was a survival society, and now it has become a sort of aspirational society, and that's what really, that's what really attracted me the most about this case study. Now the question is, what worked? Why this case study worked when the government was not really supporting the project, and and there was so much of protest going on there. So 5 things I would like to highlight here. One is the leadership approach. Now, this private developer actually was a native from the same place. He excelled in education. He got a degree in engineering from India, and then he moved to the US. And in the US, he got 2 engineering degrees in environmental engineering, and he started his own business, as I said earlier. And this business was very successful. But when the government introduced this SEZ Act, he saw an opportunity to go back and to give back to his people in the region, because of the way the region had been so backward for over all these years. So, and I think that approach, that intention, that actually worked. Normally, when we talk about growth, we really don't talk about these human sentiments, So that actually really worked, and it worked in terms of the kind of determination that he had to make that project successful. And why I'm saying that is because 2008, when the city was actually notified, there was financial crisis. And because there was financial crisis, there was no investment. And because there was no investment, there were no jobs created. People were getting against the whole city. There were protests again. I mean, in the beginning, there were no protests. But now, because there was no investment coming, no jobs created, people started getting restless at that point of time. So what he did was, he tried to attract some local firms within the SEZ. That was not the purpose of SEZ. But he just wanted to have something to show to the people and to get them employed. So he just attracted some local companies and asked them to start operating within the zone. And this is how he created some employment at that point in time. But at the same time, he tried to really upgrade infrastructure within the city. So that was a sort of determination that he had to make that place successful, that project successful. Now, this is also reflected in the various practices that he adopted. So, land acquisition model. This is very important, because most of these protests were because of this land acquisition. So, he actually offered very liberal compensation. Additional compensation was paid for trees, for other assets, like wells, tube wells, but that is not sufficient, I would say. And I don't think that was very important. The important thing was that he did not uproot anyone from their habitat. So 15 villages are still existing within the special economic zone. And then he promised a job to every single family. But it was not a kind of hollow promise. What he did was he set up a human development academy where training was given to these local people, because local people were not employable, at that point in time. So he created that academy right in the beginning, and this is how he tried to skill the people. So I think this model really worked. Of course, there was period of restlessness, as I just said, but it was a very short period, because after 2014, the SEZ started taking off. Now, the third factor that I think is very important was the kind of composition of this SEZ. It was not a service special economic zone, because in India, we all know that service sector actually has done very well. And most of these special economic zones that are successful, they are in services, offering IT, offering a place to IT firms. But this SEZ was oriented towards manufacturing. So that actually worked, because manufacturing sector requires skills of various variety, and it can employ actually everyone, very unskilled to highly skilled people. So I think that created a kind of job scenario, a job market within so I think that manufacturing matters. So this is what the point here is. Then location mattered. This place was actually very strategically located. Nobody paid attention to that at that time. You see, it was actually, there were 4 ports around that, 2 airports. It was in the proximity of a highly developed Chennai city. But not only Chennai city, there is another industrial city that is very close to it, and this is Siriperambur. So it's a sort of corridor of industrial development. It is not merely a sort of special economic zone. So this place actually became, it required some sort of trigger at that moment. And that trigger came from this special economic zones, and it became very successful. And then the strategies. We are talking about coordination between the government and the private sector. But here, the developer actually assumed the role of being a coordinating mechanism. So he actually connected the private sector with he connected the private companies, the investors, with the government, facilitated the business. He's developed beautiful infrastructure and employed this company from Singapore, Jurong International. They actually created the entire master plan, and environment to inclusiveness, everything is taken care of within the zone. So business facilitation by the developer, and then infrastructure of this actually became a kind of factors that attracted investors from everywhere, including Japanese investors. It's very difficult to attract Japanese investors, let me just tell you, and this is what I tell from my experience. They were particular about standards. So what I want to say is, there are 2 things I want to say. One is that the special economic zones can unleash opportunities in areas which have some potential. So that is something which is very important. But for that, you need to have right intentions. This is important. You have to identify the right location, and then you have to be dynamic and innovative. So that is very important. This developer not only provided services to the investors, infrastructure to investors, but he also went for aggressive marketing. So this was also something that contributed to this growth. So I think that these ingredients are somewhat very personal, some of them, but they are very critical elements of growth and urbanization and success of private investment, particularly in projects like a city development. So now this is one thing that I would like to say. And the second thing that I would like to say is that special economic zones are still not mainstreamed in the discourse, academic discourse of growth. I haven't heard anything about special economic zones since the beginning, and funders actually have a lot of opportunity here because special economic zones are not merely infrastructure. You know, you can't just create infrastructure and expect people to come and start producing. You have to have some strategy around it. So that strategic framework needs to be developed, and for that, I think the development partners can really, they can really contribute to this whole thing. And let me just final point I would like to make. I don't know how much time I'm left with. Do I have time? So, I just want to talk about Bangladesh here. Bangladesh is developing 100 economic zones. 100 economic zones. You know, in one go, and they had planned to develop all of them in by 2030, the previous regime I'm talking about. Now, the World Bank pitched in, and they actually, engaged Deloitte to prepare a master plan for that. And I am heading the team of Deloitte, and I tell you that we began by identifying the priority zones. So we identified 9 priority zones because we thought that they could be the kind of success models for the rest of the zones. And then we actually identified what all was needed to be created. So what is the kind of infrastructure, how much will be the kind of revenue involved, the funding involved, and how this funding would come, and how the private investors would be attracted into those zones. So this is what actually the thing is not yet over, and the regime changed. So I don't know what will happen eventually, but this is what the World Bank started doing, and I think it was a very good initiative, and this is what I've been talking about over these past 20 years. I'm working on this topic. So I think other funders today, we had this from Malawi, we had this very interesting comment. I really like that, and I think these are some of these things that can really help in mobilizing domestic investment within the country. So I stop here, and if there is any question, I will be happy to take. Thank you so much.
Sure, thank you, Aradhna. So we'll move to Q&A in a moment, just with the time we have left. But I think the story that you shared with us there really incorporates the lessons that everyone up here has talked about. The flexibility and coordination that the mesas that Piero talked about. We see that in the sort of planning and the sort of strategy and the execution of that particular zone. We saw the broader economic and social spillovers, like Ahmed talked about with Tanger Med from this development. And we saw the impact that actually planning for growth and to create a more conducive physical environment for investment and for business and also for living, like what Sally had talked about, can produce really extraordinary results in a very short period of time. So with the time we have left, we'll go to Q&A. Please give us your name and stand up. And please make sure that your question is a question, and try to be concise. So let's do Chema, we'll do Jonathan, and we'll do the gentleman over there as well.
I'm gonna cheat a bit. I have 2 questions. Is that okay? I have one for Piero. So as you know, at Growth Teams, we're huge fans of Mesas Executivas, and we're trying to deploy it in Tanzania and a number of countries. But I wanted to ask you, in a context where a country does not have a strong private sector, let's say you're trying to develop a new sector, and the actors on the ground are not necessarily competitive, how do you deal with that, and how you bring international know-how to the table in that methodology? And then a question to Ahmed. The story of automotive industry in Morocco is, I think, the most impactful story on the continent over the last decade. But actually what's interesting about Morocco is that there was an active prioritization of sectors starting in 2005 with Plan d'Emergence Maroc, automotive being selected. But there is a different trajectory. While automotive has picked up in a very spectacular way, there are other sectors that have struggled a bit. Can you, from your perspective as an insider, what explains the success of automotive versus other sectors that have stalled a bit?
Thank you very much. My name is Jonathan Said. I work with AGRA, which is an entity focused on agro-processing and agricultural development in Africa. My sense is that from this panel and also parts of the ones before is that, contrary to what was also said yesterday, is we do actually have a strong sense of what does work to drive growth. There's a number of different examples and evidences from different areas. For example, from the political economy, we have the Deals and Development Framework, which is a good sense of how to build growth coalitions. We have the industrial policy evidence, which Ahmed, you also touched on. We have delivery, which Piero, you touched on, and others have worked in as well. We have evidence from market systems and how you can work with anchor firms and drivers in the private sector. We have evidence on science and technology and innovation and so on. How do we actually support organizations? I'm keen on your thoughts. So bringing all these lessons, including embedded advisors, to drive progressive ministers like yourself, like Thomas from Malawi and others. How do we bring all of this together to provide support structures to governments that are struggling to accelerate growth, to unlock that, combining all the lessons of these different disciplines? Because I think that's maybe not what's not happening enough. So how do we actually channel to create support structures to bring all of these different lessons to have more, Piero Getzis and more Ahmeds and more, and also on the private sector side as well, where there's private sector business models like the SEZ model that you mentioned, more, urban planning support for city growth, etc. How do you accelerate that support structure as the development community?
Thank you very much. My name is Santosh Mehrotra, formerly of the Planning Commission of India and currently now at a visiting professor at the Institute of Policy Research at the University of Bath in the UK. I have two questions, one to Piero and one to Aradhana. Piero, thank you for that masterly summary at the end, bringing together the experience of MESA in Peru. But tell us, something that has sort of bothers me about the trajectory of industrial policy in Latin America. I've just done a paper for Trimestre Económico in UNAM's, the Mexican Foremost Journal, looking at the potential for industrial policy. Industrial policy in Latin America has gone a lot of, there's been a lot of back and forth since in the last 20 years. A lot. However, the real issue, in a sense, comes down to this. You said, by and large, the private sector asks for subventions. What are the alternatives to subventions and subsidies that they are willing to accept, in your experience, both in Latin America, in Peru, and elsewhere? To Aradhana, I have a sort of more generic question about special economic zones in the Indian context. Aradhana, since you've studied SEZs in India for a very long time, we also know that this SEZ seems to be rather unique in the experience of SEZs in India. SEZs in the last 20 years that they have come up in India have often become have been used by big corporates to sort of capture land and hold on to land and actually don't develop them. This is one question. How is it that that has been allowed to happen, and how can we stop that? Because that's the big story, not the success story, with all due respect, of the one that you talked about. The second is on clusters. We have 5,500 organic clusters already in existence in manufacturing and in other activities across the country. Unfortunately, we are not talking enough about how support can be given for such clusters in late industrializers like China, as well as in Italy. Cluster development programs were one of the most successful ways of these countries industrializing. We are more focused on SEZs. How can we also look at cluster development programs in a more careful way, rather than SEZs in India, where you and I know they haven't by and large worked? Thank you.
Okay. Maybe Piero, you want to start us off?
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about industrial policy in Latin America. Industrial policy is a bad word in Latin America. so much so that we call them productive development policies, but it's about the same, no? And it reflects also the issue that the opportunities go well beyond just manufacturing industry, right? So you think of industrial policy in the sense of having differentiated impact on different sectors, industries, right? Now we have experiences of, I mean, like to begin with, in the mesas, the private sector went to a lot of meetings. So they were very willing to work knowing that they would not be getting subsidies or exemptions, right? For example, the CERFOR is an entity in charge of forests and plantations, okay? But they also have to approve a private investment, including mining. And for mining, for the environmental impact study, you need to have some sample collect and check whether you could affect the territory, right? But the CERFOR doesn't care about mining, no? Because they worried about forests and plantations. So they had only 3 people, half-time, part-time, no guidelines, nothing. So all this mining exploration, that is a huge sector in Peru, took 6 months, right? And had a huge backlog of stuff, right? So what the MESA did is start to basically create guidelines for the CERFOR to give this, for this sample collect and hire people. So you hire 40 people to start working, the backlog disappeared, and the number of days moved from 180 days to 22 days. That is priceless for a big company. So you have a lot of stuff where you are able to create, so for example, the labor entity was asking for metal-toed tools for aquaculture in aquatic platforms, right? Because of the mining and construction labor standards. But of course, it's horrible for if you're in the middle of the sea, no? So that NESA had to change those stuff. So a lot of staff cannot be compensated by a subsidy. So they're very willing to work together, right? In that sense. Moving to Chema's question. I mean, I remember like Ricardo used to say that MESAs work for existing sectors, but not for new sectors. And that's wrong. Actually, Peru doesn't have a shipping industry, right? No, it's not shipping. I would say like a naval construction industry. How do you say, like a
Shipbuilding.
Shipbuilding and right infra. So it's a new port coming. Will be the largest port in in South America, in the Pacific area. Will allow to go to China, to export to China from 30 days to 10 days. So that's huge. So a big boats will be coming to Peru now that they don't come. So that allows the ability to actually do shipbuilding and ship maintenance. So there was a small company, the CIMA is a public entity, is very weak. They cannot cover this. So basically, the MESA started to work with trying to strengthen the CIMA, assimilate new technicals, changing the education, etc., and actually do 2 things. First, attract a large partner, and they attract Hyundai, right, heavy industries, and now it's a partner for CIMA. And also the government has some private procurement, so they're like, say, 6 boats, so they have to be built, etc. So we start to attract new guys. So the guys who are, as I said, that the guys in the mesas are not a rigid cast of characters. They move, right? We did mesas for large mining companies, or they did because I'm no longer there, right? Or for small trout producers in the Titicaca Lake. So that's the scope, right? So it's really, you can adjust the mesas. And I think the main message, right, the gentleman about how you to support, I think the first thing, you need to believe in industrial policy in the sense that really the concepts, institutions, human capital are very global, right? Very transversal. But the problems are very specific. So when you move the private sector to talk about the problems, they are not ideological anymore, because there was this this Brazilian Pedro Malan, Minister of Finance, who said the best industrial policy is no industrial policy. It's wrong, super wrong. Really, the problems are super specific to sectors, and you need to work at that level. Once you work at that level, you really forget about that discussions, right? And the good thing is that when the mesas, the finance minister, current finance minister, tried to kill the MESA because of some, whatever they say. The main the main private lobbies, the largest companies, and the small regional governors, right, in the Amazon region, were complaining. And the one thing that I really like a lot is that these guys, the small guys, had a voice. You talk about sentiment, right? These guys had a voice. The guys who were actually in the roadblocks, right, closing the roads in the Amazon, right, they putting the tires on fire and closing the roads, before the mesas are the guys who, once they participate in mesas, they felt that they were listened, they were included. No longer, there are no more roadblocks in the Amazon region as a result of the inclusion in the mesa, but now they have a voice. Because the big guys can always get around the mesa, right? They can always listen to the minister sometimes. The small guys are the guys who really appreciate that even more. So I think for small countries in Africa, I think we just need to make sure that we convey the message. This stuff works, and it's very specific. We're not talking about theories of academic works, right? We're talking about real stuff that we can actually show it implements. I'm here. I do my full-time job is in private credit. I have a company, etc. But I come to these conferences because I think it's important for people to listen to these experiences, and right, that we're not talking about stuff that could have happened, stuff that already is happening not in Singapore, in Peru, right? Which is important also. Right.
Thank you, Piero. Ahmed?
Yes, thank you very much. So regarding the first question, indeed, there is some. The success of automotive in Morocco is related maybe. The first thing is that you cannot have lots of battles at the same time. So, which means that in some other countries they try to have a lot of car builders at the same time and discussions still 4 years, and they have nothing at the end. So we focused on one car builder. So it was Renault at that time, and then when it was stabilized, we tried to bring others, and it was successful, thank God. The second thing is that we believe on ecosystem approach. You cannot become a champion of automotive if you rely only on international, multinational companies or this kind of stuff. You need to have an ecosystem, and the choice of automotive is to go very deep in the ecosystem and to have local integration. So the integration rate was at 30%. Now it's more than 60 or 65%, including also the engines. And it's very important because it creates jobs. It helps transfer of technology, transfer of know-how, and also it improves the economic landscape with the SMEs that play a very important role. And the third point is human capital. In industrial sectors, unfortunately in Africa, the main issue is the human capital and how you manage it. So in automotive, we were very aware of that. And one of the very important things that was settled is to implement LIFMIA, which means at the same time we had the first car builder, we have a very specific technical institute in all the jobs that you could do in the ecosystem of automotive. So there are some key factor of success, but there is also something that is related to the future. We don't have to be static if you want to be competitive in an emerging country or an African country. So what we try to do also is to begin to shift already our automotive industry. So now we are having the first electrical battery major plant in the African continent, and lots of also plants on that area. So we try to improve every time because it's a battle that you cannot just have a statical, but you have to be ready at all the to face all the stakes that you can face. So related to the second question, maybe for me, I was talking about common sense. It's really a conviction. You know, the political will and common sense, they are very important. We were listening some aspects related to urban planning. Indeed, solutions for me to unleash some point of growth, just to review how you see the urban planning, the thing to have, for example, the main roads and no-build zone. It's the most important thing. But with lots of documents, lots of laws, lots of regulation, you cannot achieve that. You still have that issue. So here my point is that you need to have the political will, you have to be in the delivery approach, and you have to take sometimes some simple decisions. The problem of all our ecosystem is that we work on complicated things because sometimes we try to be very focused on the theoretical part. But sometimes the solutions are on the very ground. For example, one of the things that is maybe quite shocking is that in our countries, 70 or 80% of the laws or regulation were never used. Even they were adopted maybe 30 or 40 years before. So one of the things that is related to that is that when you deliver, you have to focus on the things that go directly to results, not the lot of steps and lot of technical details that you can hand over to administrations, to private sector, but you have to follow the timeline. And sometimes you miss the timeline in education reform, health reform. You focus on lots of details, but you miss the global timeline. And for having growth, you have to be focused on the timeline and the key milestones.
Sally, you want to jump in on any of these threads?
Oh, okay.
Okay. Aradhna.
Well, let me start with Jonathan's question. In fact, in India's growth story, the worrying factor is the lack of institutional trust, as a result of which private investment has not been increasing over time. Now, this is something which is very worrying. Our finance minister keeps telling, we are giving so much, we are giving so many incentives, there are so many programs. Why are private people not getting into this growth story, and why they are reluctant to invest in the country? So I think the whole story actually shows that the government needs to support such initiatives by actually ensuring institutional support. And this is not what is happening, you see. There are some issues with the SEZ policy, there are demands, and I think this policy can go a long way. This is what because I have been actually following this policy since 2005, and actually I was working with the government of India also at that time. So I tell you that you see what is the problem. The problem is that if you are producing anything in special economic zones, you cannot sell it in the domestic market. If you sell it in the domestic market, you have to pay the full duty. Now you are having free trade agreements with other countries all over the world, but then within your country, you are actually getting those goods exported to the country with full duty paid. Now this makes the special economic zones totally unviable. So private investors are not happy. They just want that this rule should go. They should be asked to pay only on the duties that they are actually the duties that are actually foregone. Because those import duties are foregone on these in these special economic zones. So I think this is one of the major roadblock that is happening. But the government is still, so they came up with a new policy, and this policy, the name changed. That's it. Nothing changed in that policy. So everyone was working on that policy. There were debates all through the country. But what was happening? Nothing. There was nothing in the policy. So ultimately, the government had to withdraw that. You see, so these are the things which are not really working out because people don't trust the government at the moment. So I think this whole story is that you have to really create a kind of environment. Private sector is willing to invest. I mean, this is how I take it. But, it is very important that you have to have that, it's not about just having that doing business things. Yesterday we were talking about doing business things means nothing. It is these are just de jure indicators, but actual thing is not really happening. So I think that is very important, and this is what actually I have been writing also in my country, that how you really have to ensure that there is institutional trust to really bring it out, to really make these stories more frequent and more common in this country. Your question actually shows that how much distrust we have towards private investment, and actually this is how it has happened since the beginning, because we always thought that private investors were investing because they wanted to just capture land and they just wanted to use that for real estate gains. Yes, I don't rule out that possibility, but when you have this policy, it was the first time that government gave a sort of major incentive to private investors to invest in infrastructure development. You agree with me. But then, the government started backtracking. The government started losing interest because government finds that, there is no political return out of it. You are losing support of the people. And this is where, we actually had a problem. And yes, you have a regulatory mechanisms. It's not that SEZs are set up and you buy the land and you can keep that land forever. It is not like this. because there is this Ministry of Commerce. They keep, they keep reviewing the progress of special economic zones, and they keep actually, they keep meeting with these people and finding out how they are using this land. And after 3-4 years, actually, they have to get the land denotified also. So I think there are, I think we had to learn by doing, and we did not really try to learn by doing. This is what actually my assessment about the whole situation is. Instead, we try to say that, okay, this is not working this way, so either it works this way or it won't work. So I think we had to see how it could work. That movement from, not working towards working, that had to be made by the government. I think that was very important thing that we should learn. It's not like this is the policy we have made, either take it or reject it. And if you are taking it, then you have to take it as it is. So people say that, okay, so let us make some profit out of it. They start looking for some loopholes. So I think this is something, this approach, this rigidity in this whole approach, I don't think that this is very acceptable in the country, and it is affecting not only SEZ. It's not only about SEZs, it is about overall industrial investment in the country. Now, industrial clusters, you are absolutely right. We have so many industrial clusters. Why to create these new clusters? But now, if you look at these SEZs, they actually were, many of them actually came into existing industrial clusters to augment them, to improve their infrastructure. So whether you take Rajasthan, you take UP even. So in Muradabad, Muradabad is known for the export of brass products. We all know that, right? So there the government planned to have, and it is all, a very informal kind of employment that is generated in that area. So the government actually set up a huge special economic zone there, so that there is a shift of these companies, these firms, into these special economic zones with all the facilities, because people were running these small factories within the households, and this was very harmful for their health and all that. So this is what was happening. So they created a kind of large special economic zones. It failed. Completely failed. And why it failed? Because the SEZ insisted that the companies should buy certain scale of land, certain size of land. They won't allow smaller company to get inside the special economics. Now, these all were small companies, come on. How can you force them to buy large pieces of land? For them, the cost would increase. But then it happened this way. So many of these companies, they did not come, and eventually and similarly there were other such special economic zones that came into the clusters. The whole purpose was to really formalize the production system. Nothing much happened, because this is what is very important: learning by doing, having this institutional trust. I think these are some things which need to be included in this discourse, in addition to many other things that we are talking about.
I think that's a good note to end our session on. Lunch is going to be available right now in the back of the room. Thanks everyone on our panel here for joining, and we're going to reconvene at 1:30. So thank you.